This video is part 18 of my Micro-Armour figure gaming hobby series, in this case covering painting German vehicles and German troops. Specifically, what paints should you use to paint German World War II vehicles and infantry? This video is not going to tell you how to paint figures. There are much better videos available on the internet which provide an excellent guide. This is primarily designed to assist players in purchasing the correct paints to use to get their new 6mm figures painted up. Just a quick note, if you already have a German army that's fully painted up, this video is not going to be of any interest to you. It's primarily designed for new players that want to get into the hobby and want to get in the hobby using 6mm figures. It's probably not even that useful for 15mm figures because painting those require significantly greater range of paints and a lot more detail. However, if you want to have a very simple paint job on your 15mm figures, then this video may be useful. The paints I'll be suggesting are those which most players would use with a dry brush. This includes mainly Mr. Hobby, Tamiya, and I'll also be mentioning Vallejo, which I actually consider as an excellent range of paints, but may not be available in all locations. I have found paints designed for an airbrush, so please avoid them, need to be applied with an air gun and should not be applied with a dry paintbrush. So this is designed for new gamers who have probably not invested in an air gun, as you can see here. Thus, I will avoid air gun paints. But if you do wish to get an airbrush, then Iwata is an excellent brand. While I prefer a compressor with an air tank, because that gives me a more regulated flow of air, Iwata has some reasonably good electric compressors as well, and the big advantage of particularly what you see there is that it's smaller, it's more portable, it doesn't make as much noise, and I in some ways wish I had that instead of my other compressor, because every time I start that up the neighbours complain of the noise. Okay, the first point that I need to emphasise is there is no 100% correct answer to the question of what is the historically correct colour. While we can create a pot of paint which is historically correct if we have the formula, and even if we don't have the formula, we can probably look at a paint flick and create the formula to create it. In most cases, we have to deal with two issues which make this not really very useful for us. The first is lighting. When we view something, a lot of the light which is reflected off the object has also reflected off background objects or even the air. As a result, light is rarely pure white light. And if it reflects off coloured objects, it will affect the viewing or the colour of whatever you're viewing at that moment. The classic example is pure white. We rarely see pure white even when the object is actually painted pure white. There is a simple test to prove this. Purchase a piece of coloured paper from a news agency and cut a 3cm square and a 9cm square from it. Then place the 3cm square 1 foot from a table edge and the 9cm square 3 feet from the table edge. If you look at the two pieces of paper from the table height, align them up so they appear next to each other. You will notice they are a different colour. Lighter colours look darker, darker colours look lighter. And this further depends on your location, indoor, outdoor, in a desert, in a forest, etc. It also depends on how far you are from an object, as our test shows. The second issue, which you've probably already worked out by now, is colours are affected by weather condition. In most cases, fading to a lighter colour, but in some rare cases becoming darker, as occurred with a World War II Russian green painted T-34 that was shipped to the US, and during the shipping process was stored obviously in a dark location. It was in the hull of a ship, and so when it came out at the other end, the Americans did a test of the colour and basically assumed that the Russian green was actually a lot darker than it truly was. So don't try to obtain the historically 100% accurate colour, because you're never going to get there. Okay, let's first look at the common colours, which often tend to be ignored because they're the common colours. The first grade or range are metals. Whenever you paint a vehicle, you're going to be painting bits of metal. The tracks are the classic example, and weapons on infantry, and of course objects which may be hanging off a tank, chains, shovels, etc., etc. So we do need a range of greys that cover all these requirements. There are a very wide range of metallic greys, and some gamers will have their own preferences which don't match what I'm suggesting here. However, I tend to focus on three basic types of greys. I like using a light matte grey for tank tracks. I got this idea actually from the GHQ website, which shows their tanks. They're beautifully painted. And I really do like the lighter grey matte tracks. Maybe that's not 100% accurate. They should be more metallic and darker, but I just think they look really good. The other is a light gloss grey for some weapons or objects on the vehicles. I don't tend to use this very often, but nonetheless I definitely do have a light grey, which is a glossy colour. Then the next group are the dark greys, a dark matte grey for objects on a vehicle and a dark gloss grey for objects on a vehicle. And, depending on what you're painting, you may use the gloss or metallic, or you may use the matte. The next group are other metals and things which may be on the metals that you actually have painted up already. The most common is rust. In order to make your vehicle that weathered, rusty look, I tend to like having a rust colour, which I, in this particular case, use Mr. Hobby. But nonetheless, there are other things like oxidised greens, and you may have golds, if you're painting up infantry that have, different metals on them, or even vehicles with different metals on them. You may want steel reds, metal blues, titanium, golds, silvers, bronze, coppers, etc. In my case, I tend to just use one of these colours, which is the rust, but if you want to get more fancy, there's a wide range of metallic-y type colours that you can put on your vehicles or even infantry. The next are the colours which may be on your vehicles, such as glass and tyres, which are the common ones, and obviously also things like dirt, soot, oil, etc. Now, while this is not so fashionable these days, if you wish to colour your glass as blue, then I need to select a nice gloss blue colour. Tyres and other rubber are never pure black, so selecting a rubber or tyre black is required. Finally, we can deal with dirt, oil and grime, so I use an oil, soot and light grey as well to cover these things. Now, I've also added in here flesh. If you're painting up infantry, you need to select a flesh colour, and surprisingly enough to me it has a lighter flesh, and Mr. Hobby has a slightly darker flesh, so you can pretty much cover most of the racial groups. If you wish to colour someone that's, like French North Africans who have a distinctly black colour, or Senegalese or whatever, then you may have to do a bit of searching for that kind of flesh, but I would probably use other brands rather than Tamiya or Mr. Hobby for that. Because our vehicles are going to be outside, they're going to get probably covered with earth, mud, dirt, etc. And as a result, you need some colours there. I normally basically have colours to reflect earth and mud and a little bit of dust. I normally select the earth colour to match my bases. So, obviously, if you're going to have a desert, then typically the bases would be a light reddish type of brown. So I normally select that as the dirt, in this case rough sand. And if I'm in Europe, I use earth brown, which you can see there from Mr. Hobby. But, other people can certainly use a wide range of additional browns if you want to get a little bit more variety. Now we move to the more organic materials, such as woods, materials and leathers. When we select colours for wood, leather and canvas, as all these things are found on vehicles and also even on infantry, there are a wide range of colours, or wood-like colours, that you can choose from. Unfortunately, most of them aren't normally called a name which makes you think of wood, so you have to actually go through the colour chart to find it. Anyway, I've done this here. I typically stay with basically two which are marked with stars here, that is for timber, mahogany and linoleum deck brown. Now for leather and canvas, I use a single colour each in the most part, cocoa brown for leather and sail brown for canvas. I have to admit, owning all these paints, and I've used all of them as well, but I have found for a specific army you may consider standardising for a single colour for canvas, leather, etc. so you can achieve a certain level of consistency. On the other hand, real life is messy, so some gamers may decide to go for a variety of colours to reflect their troops and vehicles, particularly if they've been in action for a long time. So, vary your mud or dirt, or vary your canvas colour. Finally, you do need to have a range of primary colours such as pure white, pure black, pure green, etc. Now we come to the gritty bit. We'll start with a German infantry. There are a wide range of additional camouflage colour schemes you could consider, but what I'm mainly doing is just looking at the standard German infantryman. The German grey did seem to change based on the period in the war, being darker later in the war. I'm not exactly certain why. However, a uniform worn for several months will become quite faded, so possibly the variable colours you could use, possibly you could use just the lighter colour field grey for later war as well as early. This is my current selection, using Tamiya field grey for early and using Mr. Hobby field grey for late. Although I will almost certainly be moving to a Vallejo, in this case their German uniform grey, which is called 70-920, as I really do like those paints. But nonetheless, these are good Tamiya and Mr. Hobby paints to use for early or late war German infantry. We're now going to be moving to German tanks, specifically in Europe. Now, while the Germans did have a two-tone, or possibly even three-tone colour scheme before the war, I'm ignoring that. It could be that some of those vehicles were used in Poland, but it's generally, in the early war period, the Germans painted their tanks a single colour in the early, until they moved to a three-tone colour later in the war, I think end of 42, maybe beginning of 43. Now, there are lots of other colour schemes that were used in Europe. There was a period when the factory did not pre-paint the vehicles and simply sent out the pots of paint to the various infantry units, and armoured units, and you had some very impressive and creative camouflage. However, coming close to the end of the war, the factories once again took control of the camouflage process and began to colour all the vehicles using a standard arrangement. Obviously, even in this case, there's nothing stopping crewmen getting a pot of paint and doing their own business there. Anyway, these are the colours I normally use. You'll find a colour from both Tamiya and Mr. Hobby, which covers both of the periods, as you can see here, although I tend to prefer Tamiya for the early war and Mr. Hobby for the later war period. The desert is an area where I haven't really come to any firm conclusion at the present moment. I've identified some basic colours, and as you can see here, khaki brown from Mr. Hobby is probably the closest for German uniforms. However, again, I'm moving towards Vallejo here. They have an extremely good desert yellow, but I must admit it is very close to khaki brown. The only thing which does confuse me a bit, if you look at the infantryman, the helmet seems to be a lighter colour than the uniform. So kind of getting that right is something that I'm currently struggling with. Although I suspect if I use a Tamiya dark yellow 2 or even dark yellow, I'll get that two-tone effect. And just to note, even though they're 6mm figures, having the helmet a slightly different colour to the uniform is actually a good thing to aim for. As for the tanks, that area, I'm sorry, I haven't come to any firm conclusions at all. The unnamed brown colour you see next to the tank in the corner of that white block is supposedly the colour that was used for tanks, and that is pretty much close to khaki brown from Mr. Hobby and from Vallejo, desert yellow. However, if you look at the picture of the tank, that seems like a lighter colour, so I suspect I'm going to have to do a little bit more research here. All the colours you see here are the deserty type of colours that you could possibly select in order to paint your tanks. One little extra addendum I wish to raise. Later in the war, it is very possible that the dark yellow colour was replaced with a German grey colour. Now, there is a source that says the factories were told that if they had run out of dark yellow, they could replace it with German grey. There is also another source which indicates that if the combat ended up going to Germany, that the standard camouflage would replace the dark yellow with dark grey. I suppose if you're fighting in the forest or the Black Forest, which is a much darker environment than, let's say, the very brown French countryside, dark yellow may not be a good base colour. On the other hand, there is no real evidence that this colour scheme was ever used to any large extent. There is a bit of evidence to indicate that a platoon of Panthers had the German grey as the base colour right at the very end of the war, but I think as a general rule of thumb, I think we can dismiss this colour scheme as viable. The only thing that I find annoying is, unfortunately, I thought this was a viable colour scheme, so I've got a whole very late war German army painted up like this, and quite frankly, it annoys the hell out of me that I made this error. I'm not really familiar with the paints being used here, but the drawing here looks very nice. The two-tone effect with the tunic and the pants, the boots, etc. You know, aiming to paint something along these lines would be a good and worthy objective. You would need very high quality 6mm figures to achieve this, and I think I will purchase some GHQ 6mm figures and see if I can get this kind of two-tone effect. Okay, in summary, you've decided that you want to buy and paint up a German force mix. I've got an earlier video which gives you some guidelines of what sort of vehicles to purchase based on the period, etc., and the numbers. But the painting of it is something that is another problem that you need to overcome. So the video here has shown you a very wide range of colours, well over 100. What is the minimum number of colours necessary to paint up your 6mm, either early or late war army? This is the list. Now, the list on the left and the top two are the standard colours, so you would use that for any army. And the smaller list on the right at the bottom is the list of colours that you would use for both the early period, late period, and possibly also the desert period. So, if you're only going to do a early war German, you probably don't need dark yellow, olive green, and the red colour or earth red colour that the Germans normally used. Now, this concludes my video which covers what paints to purchase in order to get your German army painted up specifically for 6mm figures. Denken Sie daran, im Verhältnis zu kämpfen.